Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the Godslayer. Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 18, The Gear Trap. At noon, the Gear Canyon in the misty wasteland was eerily quiet. Millions of floating gears loomed in the poisonous fog, and the names of aliens from the previous Divine Throne experiment were engraved on the edge of each gear. As soon as Aiden's fingertips touched the gear fence at the entrance of the canyon, the metal surface suddenly rippled with red and silver colors, which were the residual fluctuations of the energy field during the confrontation of the two snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Watch out. Mara's snake tail suddenly swept Aiden towards the rock wall. 3 gear-shaped blades passed by the tip of his hair, carving sacrificial patterns on the ground that were the same as the gear strangulation design drawing in Chapter 3 of the prequel. Lily's gear scanner suddenly beeped, and the holographic projection showed that the spiritual vein connection lines in the canyon were automatically weaving into a pattern of 2 snakes entwining, resonating with the mark on Aiden's chest. This is the defensive mechanism of the Divine Throne. Lily's voice trembled. The gear frequencies on her goggles were jumping erratically. These gears are reading your bloodline. They're afraid that you'll inherit Vera's way of symbiosis. Aiden stared at the floating gears and found that pre-era characters were engraved on the inner side of each gear, exactly the same as the experimental log of Loren he had seen in the library of the Divine Palace. Without warning, Aiden's vision suddenly distorted. Without warning, Aiden's visions... When he came to his senses, he found himself in the old workshop of Rustman Town. His father was forging gears at the workbench, and the sound of the hammer striking and the gears turning formed an eerie rhythm. Remember, Aiden, the cracks in the gears are not flaws but the entrance of light. His father suddenly turned around, his eyes flashing with the same blood, red light as Aiden's, and his left arm was covered with gear like bones similar to Loren's mechanical transformation in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Father. Aiden rushed forward but passed through his father's phantom and saw a half piece of parchment hidden in the secret compartment of the workbench. Next to the pattern of 2 snakes entwining, a gear was marked Divine Throne Core Shutdown Device. Just then, the gear armor of the Church Knights suddenly broke through the window. The moment his father's hammer smashed onto the gear alarm, Aiden noticed that on the inner side of his wrist, there was Loren, a double snake gear mark identical to Loren's contract in Chapter 10 of the prequel. The illusion suddenly changed. His father was pressed on the gear gallows, and the mechanical palm of the church high priest was pressing on his chest, extracting his spiritual veins. Do you think you can escape by hiding in the misty wasteland? The high priest took off his helmet, revealing a gear-like lower jaw similar to Loren's mechanical prosthesis in Chapter 5 of the prequel. When Vera injected spiritual veins into your wife back then, she should have thought that the church would find you sooner or later. Aiden's blood-red eyes activated uncontrollably, and he saw that the gear cracks above his father's head were spreading at a visible speed. Each crack corresponded to a failed symbiosis experiment in the previous Divine Throne experiment. When the High Priest's probe was about to pierce his father's heart, he finally saw the smile on his father's lips, the same calm expression as when his mother was burned 3 years ago. This isn't real. Aiden roared and swung his red snake wrench, only to find that his hand passed through the illusion and touched the cold gear chains. Mara's voice came from a distance, mixed with the screeching of gear friction. Aiden, this is a memory trap created by the Divine Throne. Concentrate on resisting the gear frequency. He woke up with a start and found that his hand was somehow pressing on the gear core in the middle of the canyon, and his consciousness was being dragged into the remaining memory matrix of the Divine Throne. Inside the gear core, countless light strips unfolded in front of Aiden, each recording the failed endings of the pre-era vessels. He saw the 5th generation vessel surrounded by the church pursuers in the gear graveyard. Before his death, he stuffed the double snake jade pendant into his father's hands. He saw the 3rd generation vessel trying to fuse spiritual veins and gears but turning into a stone statue during the rejection reaction, with gear patterns on the skin exactly the same as the siphoned aliens in Chapter 4 of the prequel. They all chose destruction, and you'll be the same as them, Loren's mechanical voice echoed in the Matrix. A gear-shaped consciousness emerged from the light strips. The Divine Throne needs to devour, just as humans need gear-spelled imprints. This is the law engraved deep in the Stargate. Aiden's blood-red eyes caught that in Loren's gear chest. A mechanical heart identical to that in Chapter 5 of the prequel was beating, with a half-piece of the snake-headed sword fragment embedded in the core. Suddenly, his father's voice sounded in the memory matrix. Find Selene's gear heart ... The scene switched to the gear outpost in Chapter 14 of the prequel. His father stuffed the gear pocket watch into Aiden's hands, and the coordinates of the Blood Oath blacksmith shop on the inner side of the watch cover were glowing faintly. Aiden woke up suddenly and found that his fingernails had scratched blood marks on the gear core. The blood spread along the double snake pattern exactly the same as the blood oath mark when Vera was petrified in Chapter 9 of the prequel. It's afraid. Mara's snake tail coiled around Aiden's waist and forcibly dragged him away from the core. The core of the Divine Throne was severely damaged by Vera during the Eternal Silence disaster. Now your symbiotic concept is threatening it. She pointed to the gear in the middle of the canyon, where a star map of the previous Divine Throne experiment had somehow emerged. The coordinates of Selene's mechanical heart were flashing red, exactly the same as the direction pointed by the compass fragment obtained in Chapter 7. Aiden stared at his palm. The arrangement of the gear cracks in his blood, red eyes suddenly coincided with the star map. He remembered the gear that shattered in the gallows square in Chapter 3. The number 55 corresponded to the failed product of the first attempt to fuse the blood of the two snakes in the previous Divine Throne experiment. And Selene, as the contemporary vessel of Loren's consciousness, her mechanical heart was transformed from the residual energy core of that experiment. Mara, do you know Selene's true identity? Aiden clenched the compass fragment, feeling its resonance with the jade pendant. The frequency of her mechanical eye is exactly the same as the consciousness storage device of Loren that I found in the secret chamber of the Divine Palace. Mara's snake scales suddenly stood up. This detail was mentioned in Chapter 10 of the prequel, where the first-generation High Priest of the Church bound his consciousness to Loren using the same technology. A rumble of turning gears came from the depths of the canyon. The defensive gears began to rotate counterclockwise, and the names of aliens on each gear were seeping spiritual vein blood. Aiden's blood-red eyes saw that this blood was converging into the snake-shaped phantom of Vera, silently guiding him to the north, the direction of the gear graveyard, and also the falling point of the Divine Throne core fragments during the decisive battle of the two snakes in Chapter 8 of the prequel. The Divine Throne is trying to force me onto the path of devouring. Aiden wiped the blood from his palm. The double snake mark on the gear core suddenly glowed faintly. But the afterimage of my father hinted in the illusion that Selene's heart is the key to opening the core of the Divine Palace. He turned to look at Lily, who was analyzing the energy frequency of the gear trap. Among the data streams reflected in her goggles, the two keywords Loren's mechanical heart and Vera's spiritual vein crystal were flashing frequently. Mara suddenly let out a low chant, and the red snake pottery cup slipped from her waist. The blood pattern at the bottom of the cup resonated with the pattern of the gear core. A scene from Chapter 2 of the prequel flashed through Aiden's mind. Vera handed the pottery cup to humans during the spiritual vein symbiosis ceremony, and the scene of the Misty Wasteland's revival was reflected on the cup wall. At this moment, the resonance sound of the pottery cup perfectly matched the defensive frequency of the gear trap, forming a brief energy blind spot. Follow me closely. Aiden grabbed Mara's arm and rushed towards the depths of the canyon during the gap of the pottery cup's resonance. The gears along the way suddenly reversed, revealing the pre-era star map on the inner side. Each star corresponded to a key choice in the previous Divine Throne experiment. When he stepped into the center of the star map, the compass fragment suddenly beeped, and the pointer was pointing to the location of Selene's mechanical heart, the gear furnace on the third underground floor of the Divine Palace, which was also the initial debugging place of the Eternal Silence core in Chapter 6 of the prequel. The illusion struck again, but this time Aiden saw clearly the lip shape of his father before his death. The time turbulence area in the gear graveyard hides Loren's original intention. He suddenly remembered the gear design drawing he found in the blacksmith shop in Chapter 13. Under the double snake pattern in the corner was written, "To Aiden, may your gears always be free." The ink of that line actually mixed with the same spiritual vein fluctuations as Selene's mechanical heart. Lily, prepare the jammer. Aiden pressed the compass fragment into the groove of the star map, and the defensive system of the gear canyon suddenly malfunctioned. Selene's heart is not only a weapon, but also the key to opening the log of the previous Divine Throne experiment. If Loren really left an anti-divine plan back then, the core data must be hidden in her mechanical consciousness. When they rushed out of the canyon, the mist was dissipating. At the top of the gear graveyard in the distance, the wreckage of Loren's mechanical eye suddenly turned towards Aiden's direction, making the same gear resonance sound as the church's secret chamber in Chapter 10 of the prequel. Aiden knew that this was the Divine Throne core adjusting its defense, but at this moment, in his blood-red eyes, the gear cracks indicating Selene's death omen had decreased from 5 to 2. The opportunity his father had fought for with his life. Mara, you said that Vera's blood can make the gears rust. Aiden looked at the double snake mark in his palm. The red snake pattern was devouring the coldness of the silver snake gears. If Selene's heart is the ultimate product of Loren's mechanical transformation, perhaps only my blood of the two snakes can stop it from turning. Mara's snake tail coiled around the pottery cup. The blood pattern at the bottom of the cup and Aiden's mark complemented each other. Vera said back then that the ultimate enemy of the gears is not the aliens, but human greed for absolute order. In Selene's heart, there is what Loren fears most, his desire for symbiosis. In the twilight, the three of them stopped at the entrance of the gear canyon. Aiden stared at the floating double snake gear pattern and suddenly realized that this trap was not only the defense of the Divine Throne, but also a test left by Loren. Just like the weakness of Loren's mechanical heart that he deliberately exposed during the confrontation of the two snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. He took out the snake-shaped wrench left by his father. The embryonic form of two snakes on the handle glowed red in the twilight, echoing the gear core deep in the canyon. That night, by the campfire, Aiden opened the remaining pages of the log he brought out from the Divine Palace and found that one page depicted the structural diagram of Selene's mechanical heart. At the position of the gear core, it was marked 1, the number of the first human experimental subject in the previous Divine Throne experiment. Lily's analysis showed that this number corresponded to the first-generation High Priest, and his consciousness was now coexisting with Loren's mechanical consciousness in Selene. So they had a vessel ready from the beginning, Lily's voice trembled. Selene is not the first, nor will she be the last. The Divine Throne needs human fear and alien spiritual veins, just as gears need blood to turn. Aiden closed the log and his gaze fell on the petrified ancient tree in the distance. The crown of the tree swayed in the wind, forming a silhouette of two snakes entwining, which was the visual echo of the unity of the two snakes in Chapter 15 of the prequel. When the first blood-colored leaf fell on the compass fragment, Aiden finally understood that the gear heart in his father's illusion was not only a weakness but also a key, the symbiotic interface left by Loren during his mechanical transformation, waiting to be awakened by the blood of the two snakes. He gently stroked the gear-shaped red mark on his wrist, which was the mark left after the semi-transparent snake scales faded in the gear phantom in Chapter 17. At this moment, it was resonating with the compass fragment, pointing to the ultimate truth deep in the Divine Palace. The tremors of the gear trap gradually subsided, and the night wind in the misty wasteland brought the low chanting from the gear graveyard in the distance. Aiden knew that the Divine Throne's tests would not stop, but this time, he was no longer a passive vessel. When he buckled the compass fragment and the double snake jade pendant together, two rays of light intertwined into a red and silver gear in the night sky. It was the first true dance of Vera's spiritual veins and Loren's machinery, and also his first active choice as a double snake symbiote. Tomorrow, we're going to the Divine Palace. Aiden looked towards the east, where the church's gear fleet was gathering on the horizon. In Selene's heart, there is the truth about my mother's burning and the last weakness of the Divine Throne core. Mara nodded, and her snake tail coiled up the remaining embers of the campfire. Those sparks condensed into the shape of a red snake in her palm, exactly the same as the sacred object in the spiritual vein ceremony in Chapter 2 of the prequel. That night, Aiden dreamed that he was standing in the center of the gear graveyard. Millions of gears engraved with names were turning under his feet, and each gear reflected fragmented memories of the previous Divine Throne experiment. When he reached out to touch the gear engraved with Irene blood, oath, his mother's voice seeped out from the fragment. Aiden, The turning of the gears should not be determined by the divine throne, but by everyone who holds the hammer. When he woke up, Aiden found that new patterns had emerged on the inner side of the jade pendant, written in pre-era characters as choice. He tightly held the wrench, feeling the resonance of gears and spiritual veins in his blood, and finally understood that what his father left was not a curse but a century, spanning trust. Trusting that he could strike out his own path in the symphony of gears and blood, just like the first time the gear engraved with the embryonic form of two snakes. When Loren and Vera first cooperated in Chapter 1 of the prequel, made the sound of free rotation during the spiritual vein resonance. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now